Alright, so I have finally finished my presentation of who replaces who in Wii Sports Resort in my Wii Sports Resort mod. Yeah, this goes over all my Wii CPU Miis, and yeah, I also will update the difficulties and their hometowns. Yeah, let's go. Obside, who replaces Eva, Adelaide, who replaces Julie, Anya, who's the mix of Millie and Susanna, and of course, she also replaces Susanna. Alexei, who's inspired by Leonel, and he replaces Fritz. Ana Lucia, who replaces Sarah. Baka, who replaces Jessie. Basha, who's inspired by Susie, and she replaces Yoko. Belvedere, who's inspired by and replaces I. Bernd, who replaces Gabby. Blake, who replaces Abby. Blanche, who's inspired by the We Me Guy YT's Me Pearl, and she replaces Abe. Blonded, who's the mix of Midori and Miyu, and of course she replaces Midori. Bodhi, who's inspired by Wii U Daisuke, and he replaces Wii Daisuke, which makes sense. Bora, who replaces Siobhan. I know what you're thinking. Why doesn't Dark replace Siobhan? I'll get to her in a bit. Bowen, who replaces Vincenzo. Yeah, he's basically the cycling guy. Brian, who replaces Shinta. Bunny, who's the mix of Pian Pian and Pit. She replaces Steve. Callahan replaces Ryan. Canyon, who's inspired by and replaces Stephanie. Quiva, who's the mix of the Weemy Guy YT's Me's Aurora and Bora. She replaces Chica. Cristobal, who's the mix of Gabrielle and Pierre. He replaces Gabriele, unsurprisingly. Dark, who's the mix of Siobhan and Tommy. She actually replaces Nelly because Nelly's the strongest me, and I wanted my favorite of my Wii CPU Miis to be the strongest, and Dark is my favorite. Yeah. Da, who's inspired by and replaces Haley. Drago, who replaces Hiromasa. Ava, who's inspired by Wii Matt. She actually replaces Sandra because I have another me that replaces Matt. Yeah. Eden, who replaces Ren. Eilish replaces Jackie. Emanuele is the mix of Gabriele and Irene, and of course she replaces Irene. Eric replaces George. Fauci replaces Jake. Fishers replaces Pablo. Ritzy, the mix of Naomi and Patrick, of course replaces Patrick. Gabriel, who's inspired by Hyunwoo, replaces Hiroshi. Garth replaces James, so he's the one that basically kicks off the cycling races. Giovanni replaces Rachel. Julia replaces Rainer. Gyunghui, who's inspired by Anime Katrina 2021's Miyuki, replaces Steph. Hamoud replaces Tomoko. Hao is inspired by and replaces Luca. Haruhi replaces Fumiko. Heiko, who's a new one that's inspired by Libra Warrior 2004's Me Fatima. He replaces Helen. Hiromi, who's inspired by Nick. He actually replaces Tommy, so he's the basketball champion. And yeah. Hyunwoo replaces Oscar. Imogen replaces Giovanna. Ion, who's inspired by Adrian, replaces Andy. Eastleigh is the one that replaces Matt, so she's the swordplay champion. Jock replaces Megan, so he's the weakest CPU me. Yet, who's another new one, she's the mix of Anna and Megan, and she actually replaces Akira because I have someone else replacing Anna. Joao replaces David. Joaquin, who's inspired by Wiana, actually replaces Saburo because once again, I have someone else who's replacing Anna. Joji replaces Shohei. Carla, who's inspired by Xylene from Bodymon, replaces Nick. Katarina, who's a bit inspired by Dunbar, she replaces Eddie. Kazuhiro, who's inspired by and replaces Pierre. Kiri replaces Chris. Clara, the mix of Haru and Jasper's meat, of course, replaces Haru. Constanze replaces Kentaro. Leon, who's inspired by Zekai, is the one that replaces Anna, so he's the cycling champion. Leonid, who's inspired by the Wimi guy Waitizumi Hinata, replaces Hiromi. London replaces Ursula. Marisa, who's inspired by Gex Ghetto's Me Tasha, replaces Emily. Martin, the mix of Alex and Shinta, of course, replaces Alex. Massimo replaces Martin. Maya replaces Gwen. Merrick, the mix of Sota and Tommy, replaces Sota, because even though he looks more like Tommy, I have Hiromi replacing Tommy, so yeah. Monica, who replaces Silky. Mukta, who's inspired by Glirus' OC Lapa, replaces Ashley. Nata Akon replaces Maria. Nathaniel, who's inspired by Susanna, actually replaces Yoshi, because Anya is the one that replaces Susanna. And I also wanted him to be the table tennis vice champion. Nessa, who replaces Miyu. Patrice replaces Alicia. Peridot replaces Miguel, so yeah, he'll be the one flying the skydiving plane. Kaden, who's inspired by Eva, actually replaces Victor because Obside replaces Eva. Courtney, who's inspired by and replaces Catherine. Ra replaces Elisa. Rihanna, who's inspired by and replaces Misaki. Rourke replaces Takumi. Rory, who's inspired by and replaces Marco. Rora replaces Greg, so he's the return challenge coach. Sarabi replaces Ian. Seneca, who's inspired by Mitonia's Me, replaces Tatsuaki. Sia replaces Cole. Sylvestris, who's inspired by Poof Secure from Storm Island, replaces Shinosuke. Sophocles, who's the mix of Asami and Hiromasa, replaces Asami, unsurprisingly. Subaru, the mix of Patrick and Shota, of course, replaces Shota. T9C replaces Lucia, so she's the table tennis champion. Tatanka replaces Michael. Takata, the mix of Emma and Greg, of course, replaces Emma. Troy, the mix of the Weemy Gawaitis meets Hamilton, and Himat replaces Marisa. Tupac, who's inspired by and replaces Eduardo. Unique replaces Mike. Voss replaces Sakura. Kosa replaces Tyrone. Xing Xing, the mix of Keiko and Xiaotong, of course, replaces Keiko. Yo replaces Mia. Yuehua, the mix of Araceli and Naomi, of course, replaces Araceli. Zach, who's inspired by and replaces Takashi. Zafkiel replaces Theo. Zekai, the mix of Wii, Akira, and Holly, of course, replaces Holly. And Shasha, who is inspired by and replaces Barbara. And yeah, that's all of them.